Content warning. This episode contains detailed discussion of kidnapping, sexual assault, torture, and murder. Some listeners may find this content extremely distressing. Please take care while listening. On the 24th of March, 1987, a young woman named Josefina Rivera walked into a Philadelphia police station and asked to speak to a detective about her boyfriend. She was calm, almost eerily calm, as she began to explain that he'd been keeping women locked in a pit in his basement. The detective who took her statement that night has since said that nothing in his career prepared him for what came next. Not the words she used, but the flat, practiced way she used them. The voice of someone who had spent 4 months learning exactly how much truth was safe to tell, and to whom. Within hours, police were standing outside a modest 2-story row house on the 3500 block of Marshall Street in North Philadelphia. A house with peeling paint, drawn curtains, and a smell that hit officers before they'd even got through the front door. Inside, they would find 4 women, starved and shackled, in a hole dug into the basement floor. And in the freezer, they would find pieces of a 5th. The man who lived there preached to a small congregation most Sundays. His neighbors called him a strange but harmless eccentric. He called himself a bishop. Part 1. Building a monster. To understand what happened in that basement, you have to go back a long way, to a childhood in Ohio that, by every account that survives it, was almost engineered to produce damage. Gary Michael Heidnik was born in November 1943 in Eastlake, Ohio, the elder of 2 sons. His parents' marriage was volatile and short-lived, and after they split, Gary and his younger brother were largely raised by a father who, according to later court testimony and psychiatric evaluations, was cold, controlling, and physically abusive. One detail that surfaces again and again in accounts of his upbringing was a specific, almost theatrical cruelty. His father was said to have hung a soiled pair of Gary's underwear out of a window for the neighborhood to see, as punishment for a bedwetting accident. It's a small, ugly detail, but it tells you something about the emotional climate. This child grew up in humiliation used as a teaching tool, shame as discipline. Heidnik was, by several accounts, intellectually gifted. Some sources place his IQ well above average, and he was reportedly capable of excelling academically when he applied himself. But he struggled socially throughout his school years, was reportedly bullied, and dropped out during high school. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1962, and for a brief period it looked as though military structure might have been exactly what he needed. He trained as a medic, and by several accounts performed well. But his military career ended after little more than a year, following a diagnosis of a personality disorder. He was honorably discharged. What followed was a long, strange pattern that would define the rest of Heidnik's life. Repeated psychiatric hospitalizations, mixed with flashes of genuine financial ingenuity. Heidnik was, by any objective measure, remarkably good at making money. Using a modest initial investment, he taught himself to trade stocks and built a portfolio that would eventually be worth more than $500,000. An extraordinary sum for a man living in a rundown row house, and by the accounts of nearly everyone who knew him, showing clear and consistent signs of serious mental illness. That contradiction, a man capable of shrewd, patient, long-term financial planning, who also believed, by his own later testimony, that he could impregnate multiple women simultaneously and raise a self-sufficient family compound in his basement, would become one of the strangest threads of his eventual trial. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't disorganized. He was, by the account of expert witnesses on both sides, someone whose intelligence and delusion had somehow learned to coexist. In the 1970s, Heidnik founded something he called the United Church of the Ministers of God, a church that, in practice, mostly consisted of Heidnik himself and a small, loyal congregation drawn largely from a nearby group home for adults with intellectual disabilities. He would drive a van to collect worshippers for Sunday services held in his own living room. To the small number of people who attended, he was Bishop Heidnik, an odd but seemingly generous man who took an interest in people society had mostly stopped paying attention to. It's worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it's not incidental to what happened later. Heidnik built his church, deliberately, around a congregation of people who were vulnerable, who were often isolated from family, and who were unlikely to be believed or listened to closely if they ever tried to describe something disturbing happening in his home. That wasn't an accident. It was, investigators would later conclude, closer to a hunting ground. In 1985, Heidnik met and married a woman named Betty Distow, a Filipino immigrant, through correspondence, what was then commonly called a mail-order arrangement. The marriage was brief, and by most accounts, deeply unhappy. It ended in divorce within roughly a year. But it's noted by several biographers of the case as one more example of Heidnik's pattern, seeking out women in circumstances of vulnerability and dependency, where the ordinary balance of power tilted heavily in his favor. By the mid-1980s, Gary Heidnik was in his early 40s. He had money. He had a house. He had, in his own mind, a plan, one he would later describe to police almost matter-of-factly, as though it were a business proposition rather than a horror. He wanted, he said, to father as many children as possible, using multiple women held simultaneously, in order to build what he called his own family. He began looking for women in late November of 1986. Part 2, The Pit, on the 25th of November, 1986. The night before Thanksgiving, Heidnik was driving through North Philadelphia when he pulled over for a 25-year-old woman named Josefina Rivera. Rivera worked, at times, in survival sex work, and it wasn't unusual for her to accept rides from men who approached her that way. Heidnik offered her money. She got in the car. Back at the house on Marshall Street, after the two had sex, Heidnik attacked her, choking her into unconsciousness. When she woke, she was in the basement, and he had already begun what would become a horrifyingly methodical process. He dug a rectangular pit into the concrete floor, roughly aligned with the wall, and covered it with a piece of wood weighed down with heavy weightlifting plates so that whoever was inside couldn't push it open. Rivera was placed inside. For more than 3 weeks, Rivera was Heidnik's only captive. Then, on the 3rd of December, he abducted a 24-year-old woman named Sandra Lindsay, someone Heidnik actually already knew, because she had been a member of his church congregation. Court testimony would later establish that Heidnik had gotten Lindsay pregnant at some point before her abduction, and that she'd had an abortion, a decision that, according to testimony, had angered him deeply. Lindsay had an intellectual disability, which made her, like the other members of Heidnik's congregation, someone he clearly regarded as easier to isolate and control. Over the following weeks, Heidnik brought more women into the house. On the 23rd of December, 19-year-old Lisa Thomas was lured back to Marshall Street, drugged, and placed in the basement with the others. On the 2nd of January, 1987, 23-year-old Deborah Dudley was abducted in a similar manner. Later that month, on the 18th of January, 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins became the 5th woman brought into the house. By this point, Heidnik was holding multiple women simultaneously in a pit in his basement, a detail so far outside ordinary human experience that when it finally reached investigators months later, several would describe it as feeling less like a crime scene and more like something out of a nightmare they hadn't yet woken from. The conditions inside that basement were designed, deliberately, to break down every one of the women's physical and psychological defenses. They were kept half-naked and shackled, sometimes with their wrists cuffed to overhead pipes, They were fed irregularly and inadequately. Testimony would later describe meals of dog food, bread, and, in the case of one particularly horrifying detail that emerged at trial, food that the women were later told, and came to believe, had contained the remains of one of their own. Heidnik subjected the women to sustained physical torture. Court records describe the use of electric shocks and an incident in which he stabbed into a victim's ear canal with a screwdriver, an act that permanently damaged her hearing. He raped the women repeatedly, and at various points forced them into sexual contact with each other, apparently as both a form of humiliation and, disturbingly, something he seemed to regard as entertainment. And he worked, consciously and with real strategic patience, to turn the women against one another. This is one of the most psychologically complex and uncomfortable threads of the entire case. Heidnik rewarded compliance and punished resistance in ways clearly designed to fracture any solidarity between his captives. Better food, occasional privileges, even physical freedom from the pit, offered to whichever woman was, at that moment, most willing to inform on or assist in controlling the others. It's within that dynamic that Josefina Rivera's role in this story becomes genuinely difficult to sit with. As the longest-held captive, Rivera gradually became something like Heidnik's second-in-command inside that house, at times participating in the punishment of other women, at times physically restraining them on his instruction. It would be a serious injustice to describe this the way a courtroom might describe an accomplice acting out of free will. Every account of Rivera's actions inside that house, her own testimony, corroborated by surviving victims and accepted by prosecutors, situates her behavior within an extreme, sustained campaign of coercive control, the kind of environment where compliance isn't really a choice in any meaningful sense, it's survival. What Rivera was doing throughout those 4 months, according to her own later account, was something far more calculated than it might have looked from the outside. She was quietly, patiently working to earn enough trust to eventually get herself and the other women out alive. Part 3. A death in the basement. By early February 1987, the situation inside the house had already turned fatal once. On the 7th of February, Heidnik became enraged with Sandra Lindsay. The precise trigger for his anger has never been entirely clear, but by several accounts, it followed her attempting, or being suspected of attempting, to help another captive escape. As punishment, he handcuffed her by one wrist to an overhead pipe and left her suspended there for several days, giving her only bread and water and beating her intermittently while she hung. By the time he finally released her, she had developed a severe fever and was gravely ill. She died the following morning. What Heidnik did next is among the most disturbing details in the entire case, and it's one this script won't dwell on beyond the essential fact of it. He dismembered Lindsay's body, using power tools, disposing of some remains and storing others. Portions of her remains would later be found by police in his freezer. And in one of the cruelest details of the entire case, confirmed through testimony from surviving victims, the remaining women were, at various points afterward, deceived into consuming food that they came to believe contained parts of her remains, mixed into meals Heidnik prepared for them. Rather than pausing his plan after Lindsay's death, Heidnik continued it. He would go on to abduct a sixth and final woman, 24-year-old Agnes Adams, in the weeks that followed, apparently intending to keep the number of captives in the house at a level he considered necessary for the family he believed he was building. The second death came in March. Deborah Dudley had been, by multiple accounts, the most consistently defiant of Heidnik's captives, repeatedly resisting him, at real personal cost, in ways the other women had learned to avoid. On the 19th of March, 1987, Heidnik placed her in the water-filled pit in the basement, and in an act the courts would later formally classify as murder by torture, electrocuted her. He and Rivera disposed of her body afterward in a wooded area of New Jersey's Pine Barrens, a stretch of forest with an unfortunate historical association with the state's unsolved and disposed of dead. 2 women were now gone. 4 remained. And time for the survivors was clearly running out. Part 4. The escape, whatever calculation Josefina Rivera had been quietly running for 4 months. It came together in the final days of March 1987. By this point, Rivera had gained enough of Heidnik's trust that he allowed her limited freedom outside the house. Trips that, on the surface, looked like errands or visits to see her family, but which Rivera used carefully and without tipping her hand to plan an actual escape. On the 24th of March, Heidnik allowed her to leave the house to visit her family, apparently confident, dangerously, fatally confident, that she'd return. She didn't. Instead, Rivera made her way to a Philadelphia police officer and calmly and methodically described what had been happening on Marshall Street. It's a detail almost too cinematic to be believed, and yet it's exactly what several accounts of that night describe. The flat, controlled way Rivera delivered information that should have sounded, to any reasonable listener, like the ravings of someone in the middle of a breakdown. Multiple women, a pit, a murder, a dismemberment. And yet something about how she said it, precise, unhysterical, exact on details a person couldn't invent, told the officers this wasn't fiction. Police moved on the house within hours. Attorney Chuck Peruto, who would later become involved in the case, has recounted what officers found when Heidnik answered the door. He wouldn't let them inside, and it was the smell coming from behind him, the unmistakable smell investigators would later trace to the remains kept in his freezer, that told them everything they needed to know before they'd even stepped over the threshold. Heidnik was taken into custody on the spot. Inside, police found 4 surviving women, Lisa Thomas, Jacqueline Askins, Agnes Adams, and the woman who'd been most recently taken, shackled and in the basement pit, in conditions of starvation and physical deterioration that responding officers would describe, years later, as among the worst they'd ever encountered. In the freezer upstairs, they found roughly 27 pounds of human remains. The House of Horrors on Marshall Street was over. What came next was the long, public process of trying to hold Gary Heidnik legally accountable for what he'd done. Part 5. The trial. Gary Heidnik was charged with an almost overwhelming list of offenses: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of kidnapping, 5 counts of rape, 2 counts of involuntary, deviate sexual intercourse, and 4 counts of aggravated assault. His defense team pursued an insanity plea, and on paper, it wasn't an unreasonable strategy. Heidnik had a well-documented, decades-long history of serious psychiatric hospitalization. Multiple mental health professionals across his adult life had diagnosed him with conditions serious enough to warrant institutional care. His own account of his motives, that he genuinely believed he could father a self-sustaining family through multiple simultaneous captive pregnancies, sounded, on its face, like the thinking of a man detached from reality. But the prosecution built a case designed to show that whatever psychiatric conditions Heidnik lived with, they hadn't stopped him from planning, executing, and concealing his crimes with real, sustained, rational calculation. Prosecutors pointed to the sheer organizational discipline of what he'd done, the deliberate selection of victims who were less likely to be reported missing quickly, or less likely to be believed if they were found, the digging and covering of the pit, the systematic use of psychological manipulation to divide his captives against each other, the careful disposal of Deborah Dudley's remains in another state entirely. They also brought in his stockbroker, whose testimony illustrated just how methodically Heidnik had built his 6-figure investment portfolio, hardly the work of a man too disorganized by illness to control his own actions. The jury didn't accept the insanity defense. On the 1st of July, 1988, Gary Heidnik was convicted on both counts of first-degree murder, along with the full slate of related charges. 2 days later, the same jury returned a sentence of death. Pennsylvania's appellate courts would spend years reviewing the case, as is standard in any capital conviction, but Heidnik's convictions and sentence were ultimately upheld. He spent more than a decade on death row. On the 6th of July, 1999, Gary Heidnik was executed by lethal injection at Pennsylvania's State Correctional Institution at Rockview. Accounts from witnesses present that day describe an unusually charged atmosphere in the viewing room. Among those present were relatives of Sandra Lindsay and Deborah Dudley, along with survivor Jacqueline Askins. When Heidnik was declared dead, applause reportedly broke out among some witnesses, and at least one person could be heard saying, simply, "Thank you, Jesus." For Sandra Lindsay's family, the moment was complicated rather than purely cathartic. Lindsay's sister has since spoken publicly about how strange it felt to watch an execution carried out with such calm, procedural quiet. Lethal injection, by design, offers none of the chaos or violence of the crime it's meant to answer for. "It was too calm and serene for me," is how one survivor later described watching it happen. Part 6. What was left behind the 4 women who survived Marshall Street: Josefina Rivera, Lisa Thomas, Jacqueline Askins, and Agnes Adams, went on, in the years that followed, to live lives that were, understandably, shaped permanently by what had happened to them. Several gave testimony that was instrumental not just in Heidnik's conviction, but in the broader public understanding of how coercive control functions inside a captivity situation. How compliance, complicity, and survival can look identical from the outside, and how completely different they are from within. Josefina Rivera, in particular, has occupied an uncomfortable and complicated place in the public memory of this case. It would be easy and wrong to reduce 4 months of sustained torture and psychological control down to a simple story about a woman who chose to help her captor hurt other people. The far more accurate and far more human version is a story about someone who endured something almost impossible to imagine, adapted in whatever ways she could to survive it, and ultimately used the only leverage she had left to save 4 lives, including her own. That doesn't erase the pain her actions caused other survivors, some of whom have, understandably, struggled with complicated feelings about her role. But it does explain why prosecutors never treated her as anything other than a victim and a witness, because that is, in every meaningful sense, what she was. Gary Heidnik's crimes left a mark well beyond the Philadelphia courtroom, where he was tried. It's worth ending, then, not on the fiction Heidnik's crimes inspired, but on the facts of what he actually did, and to whom. Sandra Lindsay was 24 years old, a member of a church congregation built specifically to include People's Society, too often overlooked. Deborah Dudley was 23, and by every surviving account, the most consistently defiant of the 6 women held on Marshall Street, right up until the night that defiance cost her life. Both women deserved so much more than what they got from Gary Heidnik, and arguably from a system that, for years, hadn't done enough to notice men like him operating in plain sight, hunting specifically among people least likely to be believed. The house at 3520 North Marshall Street was eventually demolished. There's no marker there today, nothing to indicate what happened inside it for 4 months in the winter of 1986 into the spring of 1987. But the record of it, in courtrooms, in testimony, In the accounts, the survivors themselves have since chosen, at real personal cost, to share remains. And it remains precisely so that this story doesn't quietly disappear the way Gary Heidnik very nearly made sure his victims would.